You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Can it really be October without some intriguing and mystifying ghost stories? Of course not. And who better to join me than Ruth Roper-Wylde to share some brand new accounts from the new book, These Haunted Times, Volume 3. We've a haunted Bothy, some odd goings-on in a couple of bathrooms, ghostly footprints, a pub seemingly full of ghosts, and much more. But before that, as always, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mysteriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as usual. You can also subscribe via Apple Podcasts by clicking the link in the show notes or looking on Apple Podcasts for Mysteries and Monsters. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for news, episodes and merchandise. Our opening and closing themes are provided by the incredible Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork. The show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys. And Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So, let's join Ruth as she reveals a few tantalising cases from her brand new book, These Haunted Times, Volume 3. As Halloween approaches, what better way to see in the spirits than in the company than none other than our good friend Ruth Roper-Wylde. With a bumper bibliography behind her, Ruth has brought some brand new experiences and accounts to share with us on Samhain, or as Dr. Samuel Loomis once famously said, Samhain. Ruth, welcome to Mysteries and Monsters.
Oh, thank you so much. What a nice introduction. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Not many people get mentioned with Donald Pleasance, but there you are.
But there you go.
Still makes me laugh, that. 40 years on, I still can't believe that they put that in a major film that somebody called it Samhain.
No.
The 80s. How are we?
Pretty good, actually, thank you. Been quite a nice summer, despite the lack of summer. But I'm not a person for lots of heat, so I'm probably one of the few people in Britain who's been dancing around through the rain thinking, this is great.
Well, I had to laugh. As we often joke, and I'm sure our non-British listeners can often sometimes get annoyed with us constantly talking about the weather. But at the end of August, I went to Keswick and did the ghost tour there, which was great fun. And on the Sunday, we went up to the Stone Circle up there, which was incredible. And I had to wear a jumper, Ruth, and a hat because it was tipping it down and it was 12 degrees. And yeah. On the following Saturday, I was sat in a pub beer garden wearing shorts and a T-shirt.
And probably nearer 30 degrees.
It was. So, welcome to England, everyone.
Absolutely. Choose your wardrobe.
Yeah, pack for every weather imaginable, usually.
Yes.
So, another exciting few months ahead. You've got one book flying towards us very shortly as we speak. This episode will be going out at the end of October, obviously, and hopefully it should be available for everybody to enjoy. And you're treating us with another one in rapid succession, hopefully for Christmas as well, Ruth.
I've gone a bit mad this year, haven't I? My fan base, bless them, are quite used to having to wait roughly a year in between books, because that's about how long it takes me to do the research and do the writing and so on for each book. But as I mentioned earlier in the year, I seem to have gone a bit mad when writing this one. And about, maybe just over a third of the way through it, I hit the Google word limit. which I didn't know there was a Google word limit on Google Documents, but there is. It's at 676 A4 pages. And at that point I thought, actually, I can't do a book that's 676 A4 pages because it would cost somebody about 50 quid to buy it, probably, with the printing costs. So I had to split them anyway. Long story short, I had to split, and that was a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be, but there we go. But the net result was that These Haunted Times 3 should be out by the time the listeners are listening to us talk about it, because it is actually fully written now, and I'm just doing the fiddling around with it and trying to find all the typos, which I fail dismally to find them all usually. And then These Haunted Times 4 should follow shortly after, in time for Christmas, if I keep my nose to the grindstone and don't go wandering off actually looking for ghosts instead of writing about them, which is always my downfall. I'll just wander over to so-and-so and have a look to see if I can see the ghost there instead of doing a day's writing like I'm supposed to.
Well, obviously, we're spoiling everybody because you were very kind enough to join me as part of my 250th episode celebration. So thank you again for that, and sharing some exclusive stories with us that we'd not discussed before. And we've got another bumper crop here of wonderful stories that are going to be appearing in the upcoming box. And I had to chuckle, Ruth, a couple of things. We often talk about strange things and occurrences. The second story we're going to touch on, I'll get to what the strange coincidence for, because when I saw what you'd sent, I just thought that sometimes doing this show and talking about this subject just makes me chuckle about the synchronicity of things, shall we say.
Synchronicity is a thing that absolutely fascinates me. There's almost a book in itself there, isn't it? Well,
I know, it's very similar. It's one of those strands that often gets overlooked and people always brush it off as coincidence, or as Jim Harold is a big proponent of, that just one of those things theories that people often say, oh, it's just one of those things, isn't it? But is it?
But is it? Yeah, or isn't it? Who knows?
So our first story, this is one of those things, I think, that a lot of people who enjoy the paranormal will obviously be fans of the marvellous Danny Robbins and the work he's done over the last 3 or 4 years with his wonderful series. Obviously, he's done the Battersea Poltergeist, the Witch House, his Uncanny series. And one of the most chilling episodes of his first season on Uncanny, Ruth, was about 2 lads in the 1970s who spent a terrifying night in a bothy. And I think it's weird sometimes how these occurrences or these locations suddenly appear in more stories than you're aware of, because I don't think many people, unless they were either Scottish or had been to Scotland and knew what one was, would be aware of what even a bothy was.
Well, quite possibly not. And I actually know that episode you're talking about. And you're right, it is a really interesting story. And it is in exactly the kind of property that my own story is set in. At an actual, Crofter's Cottage, or Bothy, as they were known. And these are those tiny little stone-built Crofter's cottages, often built way up on the mountainsides, in the middle of nowhere, and there's loads of them dotted all over the Highlands and other parts of Scotland, and many of them are fallen into disrepair and ruin, but some of them have been, renovated and converted into properties that people are either living in or that people are again crofting from, in other words having a small holding, or that people are just renting out as holiday lets. That's the other thing they're quite popular for, is holiday lets. But there are still loads of them that are sort of tumbled down and falling to rack and ruin. But yeah, like you say, unless you happen to be familiar with Scotland, you might not know the term bothy. But I think more people might have heard of Crofter. I think it might be a more popular term because it pertains to quite a few of the islands, and Shetland and all the rest of it all use the term, don't they, more widely? Yeah.
And I think as well, the location here, Sant, or a saint, depending on how you wish to pronounce it, because I know the Gaelic is more of it's more of a saint at Loch-an-Ardain, is one of those wonderful parts of Scotland. There is, as I like to call it, It's just so beautifully remote. It's wonderful.
Do you know, I think people often forget when they talk about the UK, even people here in the UK, especially here in England, they forget that Scotland is the same size as England, roughly speaking.
Yeah.
Now, the English particularly tend to think of England as the big bit, and then there's a little bit tucked off in the west called Wales, and a little bit tucked up in the north called Scotland. And it's only when you look at a map and look at it properly that you realise that Scotland is pretty much almost the same size as England, top to bottom. It's just a bit narrower from east to west, because obviously England has that kind of fat-bottomed shape,
Yes.
that we're all familiar with. So, yes, it doesn't cover as much landmass because it's narrower, but it's actually nearly as many miles from the border to the tip as it is, from southern England to the border. And so, Loch Anna or Dane that we're talking about here is on the northwest tip, really. It's right up near the northwest corner, just a little tiny way in from the sea, practically in view of the sea. And it really is incredibly remote. I've done a couple of holidays up kind of that neck of the woods, not quite up that far, but you're looking at, from where I am in Bedfordshire, you're looking at 500-600 miles of driving to get there, and sort of 10-12 hours of driving easily. And that's if you don't take many breaks. And obviously once you get past Loch Lomond, in the Southern Highlands, it just gets more and more and more remote, and further and further and further between each little bit of civilization, if you like.
Yeah.
And petrol stations get harder and harder and harder to find.
Yes.
And when you do it always astonishes me, even in my most recent trip to Scotland, which was 2 years ago, year and a half ago. One of the petrol stations I visited still had the pumps in pounds, shillings and pence and were held together by baling twine. And what you had to do was, there's a little notice on it saying you have to go and knock on the shop opposite and tell them what figure had come up, when you filled the car in the pounds, shillings and pence. And then they had a conversion table next to the till to tell you what it was in today money. That's how remote it is.
I love Scotland. I spent a wonderful holiday there about 20 years ago now, Ruth, and just fell in love with it. We were very blessed. It was probably one of the best spells of weather I think they've ever had north of the border. And it was just driving through the Highlands, because we drove all the way up from Glasgow, and we just took a tour for 2 weeks. We went all the way up to Inverness and obviously Loch Lomond and Loch Ness, and did all that, and we came down the west coast, and it was one of those. I just couldn't stop looking out the window with my, pushing my jaw back up, because the heather and the moor, it was just beautiful. Every
corner you turn is spectacular, isn't it, up there?
Yeah.
It's just gorgeous. I must admit, it is one of my favourite places. I let one of my dogs paddle in Loch Ness once whilst on a trip up there.
Yeah.
And watched the dog with sharp eyes the whole time he was in there, because I was mildly worried it might get eaten by the Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah, well, you never know. The last time I was at Loch Ness, I ended up sunbathing. It was that hot. I mean, how many people can say that in their lifetime, Ruth?
Well, I must admit, whenever I've been to Scotland, the weather has been astonishing. If you go early in the year, it seems to catch quite good weather around, just before mid-season starts.
Yes.
Because it's a good idea to go before mid-season starts.
Yeah.
I've often caught really, really good weather up there, and people don't realise how many beautiful unspoilt beaches there are.
Yeah.
It's just a fabulous place. Absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of places, once you get past York, a lot of people aren't really sure. It's the same with the North East, County Durham and Northumberland. Some of the beaches and views up there are just amazing.
Do you know, that's one bit of the country that's on my to-do list. Because I want to go and see the dark skies bit as well.
Yeah.
Just because that I mean, God, you spend hours looking for UFOs and lights and everything passing over in a proper dark skies area, couldn't you?
Yeah.
So it's still on my to-do list. I used to go up to Newcastle quite a bit for work at one point in my career. So I sort of saw little bits of it. When I had a little bit of time, I'd go out for a little drive in the evening or whatever. just enough to kind of whet my appetite and think, actually, away from the big city parts of it, because I'm not a city girl, I'm much more a country girl, it looks like it's really beautiful up here. It really needs a visit. So it is on my to-do list, but I haven't yet done it, I must say.
Yeah. It's another place I've got a real soft spot for, and I did the Sheffield to Edinburgh train journey at Easter, which takes you up by the coast. So, once again, spent 3 hours just staring out of a window like a gormless twerp.
Oh, but I bet it was good, though.
Oh, stunning, especially because you're literally about, I don't know, 200 foot away from the sea and some parts of it. It's wonderful.
Absolutely brilliant.
But I think I would rather be on a train than these Bothys, Ruth. And as we mentioned about the Uncanny episode, this one's a little bit more, I don't know, I mean, there are lots of stories of a similar nature from around the country where people hear things that it's as though they've accidentally stumbled into a party or someone's having a celebration. Wherever you are, there seems to be stories like this in houses, parks. I've even heard some on beaches where people have heard the sounds of celebration. But here, this is quite unusual, I think, because of what it is and the location it is. It's not the kind of... Well, I don't think so anyway, Ruth. I'm not sure what you would think. I wouldn't put this kind of noise in this kind of location, if that makes sense.
No. So if I give a little bit of a story about what it was, this was a story that came to me from my correspondent who wanted to stay anonymous. Mm-hmm. They gave me the tale which had been told to them directly. So it's secondhand to me, but it came from a first-hand source, if you see what I mean. And my correspondent, had got it directly from the old crofter or shepherd who actually witnessed this. So this old man, Highlander, lived up there all his life, worked the mountains with the sheep, had his own croft and what have you. And he was gathering the sheep down off the high mountain one winter's afternoon, which is what they call the sheep gap. And this wasn't very many years ago. I'm only talking within the last decade or so. The afternoon was waning towards dusk, so you've got that sort of half light. And the path that he was taking down the mountain went down towards Loch Anordane, so he's somewhere up near there. I can't be too precise with the location because that would be unfair with the person who probably owns the cottage now. But his particular path took him past what used to be one of these old bothys. And it was one that had been renovated and changed into a holiday let. But because he works the area obviously all year round, he knows that it really only gets let out to holiday people through the summer months. It doesn't attract, because of how remote it is. It's, right up the mountain in the middle of nowhere, doesn't have any Wi-Fi up there or anything like that. And, you'd have the danger of getting stuck up there if the snows came in. So it really isn't normally let out through the winter. It just stands empty. So you can imagine the scene of him with his flock of sheep moving ahead of him. He's keeping them at a nice steady pace, just letting them walk down the mountain. It's as quiet as anything. Sunset is near when he hears the sound of people laughing and chatting and music. So all the sounds that you'd think of pertaining to a party going on the side of a mountain in the northwest of Scotland at dusk on a winter's evening. None of it makes sense. The timing, why would you be having a party at sort of 3 or 4 in the afternoon, which is when it's going to be getting dark, out in the middle of nowhere? Where on earth are they going to be partying? None of it really made any sense. So, of course, he's listening to this and feeling puzzled about it. But he realises the noise must be coming from this holiday let, this renovated Bothy. So he just gets overly curious, to be honest, and decides to just go and take a peek and see if somebody's meant to be there, or is there, a load of people there that shouldn't be there? Does it look okay? But he let the sheep carry on walking ahead of him, and he literally turned up the short little track that went to it, stepped 1 foot on it, and all sound ceased. House was stood there cold and empty, totally in darkness, clearly nobody there, no vehicle, no nothing. and suddenly all he'd got was the sound of the wind and the sheep themselves, and there was clearly nobody there. So where would this sound come from in the middle of nowhere?
I mean, that's the thing as well about such an experience, because as often people will say, oh, well, you know, noise can carry a fair distance. But places like this, there's nowhere near.
No, and I think this is one of those classic cases where unless you've spent time up in the Scottish Highlands, you don't realise how remote it is. And to say that sound can carry, which it can, that's very true, but it can't carry the distance that it would have to the next nearest inhabitation. So, you know, we spoke once before about my own experience up in that neck of the woods when I heard the engine going across the bridge.
Yes.
The nearest inhabitation to that bridge was 8 miles away. And there's no way the sound could have carried up mountain. And, you know, I'd had to go down a 1 in 4 long winding road to get into a deep cleft of a mountain where this particular lock, where that bridge that I heard the sound was. Sound doesn't travel like that. It doesn't go up a mountain and down the other side. No. Yes, you could say that might have been somebody at the other end of the same little lock that I was on. Sound could carry that far, sure, particularly with the, you know, the way the topography was holding the sound in, except that I was on the only road. There was no other road. So, you know, for it to be an engine, it had to be on my road or up in the sky above me, which it wasn't. So, yes, sound can carry, but it can't do the impossible. So when you're talking about this shepherd up on, and this is, you know, this isn't somewhere he doesn't know. Yeah, exactly. This is land he knows well. He's been a shepherd on it his entire life. He's walked those mountains through all weather and all seasons, all his life, following the sheep. He knows where the sounds can and can't come from. And he knows they were coming from this cottage because that was the only possible location, you know, that sound could come from. And yet when he literally, and he walked right up to it, it was just as he went to step onto the property's boundary that the sound ceased. So right up until that point he could hear it. Creepy, isn't it? I love that sort of little tale of just, there's nothing much to it. There's no huge substance. There's none of these big, you know, most haunted screaming, running around, or Zach Bagans, oh, it must be a, you know, portal to hell and the devil himself and all. It's just an ordinary, creepy little moment in time. And yet it holds such amazing possibility behind it. Yeah. Because it could be time slip that we're talking about here. He could have been hearing a little glimpse into the realm of the Fae. Yeah. It could be ghosts of a party long gone. It could be ghosts of clansmen long gone. Yeah. Up there partying with music going. Yeah, there's so many possibilities of what it could be that he'd heard for a moment on such a small little snippet of a creepy tale. Fascinates me. Yeah. And like you say, this is a person who knows this area extremely well. The chances of this, as we said, being sound carried from somewhere else, well, if that was the case, then he would probably have heard it before. Yes. But then why does it suddenly stop as soon as he gets to it? That's not how sound works. No, absolutely not. I love it because, like you say, it's not particularly frightening, but it's compelling because of its normalness. Yes, just a chap going about his ordinary everyday business. The fact that his ordinary everyday business regularly takes him up to such a remote area where he knows that the only thing you can hear is the wind and the insects and the animals, nothing more. You know, maybe the occasional plane, I would imagine, but even that, even up there in Scotland, you don't hear much in the way of planes either, like we do down here in the south. Yeah. Because by the time they've left any of the big airports and are going up to wherever they're going, they're so high that the sound is that very faint high sound that you only catch sometimes. You don't get the ordinary sound of jets that we get being within sort of 20 miles of an airport where they're still climbing or you know, starting to circle whatever 20 miles out from the airport. You don't get that level of noise from the jets. You just see them high up in the sky with a contrail maybe. Yeah. Well, even here in Sheffield, Ruth, we're under several flight paths, and it's only when it gets to sort of 11, 12 o'clock at night
that you can actually hear the planes coming over, even though they're probably not as many as there are in the day, because the normal hubbub of day-to-day living just drowns them all out. So it's only late at night when you will occasionally hear them if you're outside.
Yeah. I mean, we get them here because we've got Cranfield Airport just up the road, which, although a tiny little airport belonging to Cranfield University, it gets a lot of interesting aircraft come into it, because that's where people come in when they're visiting places. So, you get royalty and dignitaries arriving there sometimes who have got to be somewhere in this area of the country. But yeah, like you say, you're used to aircraft noises and things like that. And up there, when you say it's silent, it really is silent, other than perhaps a sheep.
Yes.
You might hear a deer call on the wind. Yeah. But, I've sat on a rock up there. For those that don't know me, my mobility is a bit limited, so I tend to drive somewhere and then get out with my dogs and walk about a little bit, but sit and just enjoy for a long time. I'll walk to a little rocky outcrop or something and sit on the rocks. So I've spent a lot of time just sitting, watching and listening when I've been up there. And it really is silent, other than a few noises of nature.
Yeah.
So to hear this music and laughter on the wind clearly coming from this property, it really is easy to pinpoint a sound like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it's a beautiful little story. I love it. It's marvellous.
These little ones are often my favourite,
Yeah. Well, strangely enough, coming at it from the opposite side of peace and tranquility is the next one, which is TGI Fridays in Bracknell. Which is anything... I had to choose something
the absolute opposite, yes.
Which is anything but sedate, depending on the time of day you may visit it. And before we started, and I chuckled about synchronicity and coincidence, I went to visit my daughter in Lincoln. She's at uni there on Saturday, Ruth. And guess where we went for something to eat?
TGI Fridays, by any chance?
We did indeed. Though I didn't have an experience like this. Contributor did.
Probably just as well.
But, as always, one of the wonderful quirks of paranormal is I like weird stories about specific things, and haunted toilets are always something that makes me chuckle, though I suspect often if I experience what some people do in toilets, I wouldn't be chuckling. I'd probably be thankful I was in the right place, I have to say.
Yeah, you might not be chuckling quite so much, yeah.
Through your research, is this something that you get a lot of? Because I think some people kind of dismiss these, or they don't look at them. As with certain aspects of the paranormal, there are certain things that happen, as we've touched on before, where some people will just dismiss it because it's not what they class as a real haunting for whatever, as though there's a rule that if a ghost's in a bathroom or a toilet, it's not the same as a ghost in a church or a hall or a home for some reason, Ruth. And I've never really understood that. Surely haunted's haunted, is it not?
Well, the other thing that really just baffles me sometimes is the number of times either people ask me, or I hear people say, or hear people discuss, well, it can't be a haunting because nobody's ever died in that building and there was nothing there before it. And I just look at them and think, but you're making such a supposition that the word haunting equals a dead person.
Yeah.
And we're not at the point where we've ever proven that yet.
No.
The word haunting is such a wide definition word. It can be applied to so many different phenomena that you could start to list out. The list would be pages long. White ladies, monks, animal ghosts, wisps of a ghost seen, disembodied voices, poltergeists. All of these can be described by the word haunting and are accepted, in modern parlance as haunting. And yet somehow then we say, oh, it can only be a haunting if it's an old building that somebody, had a tragic death in. And my answer to that is, what a load of poppycock. In my personal view, the paranormal can pop out wherever it blooming well wants to, whenever it blooming well wants to, because we haven't yet determined what it is. And therefore, how can we possibly place human restrictions on where we think it should be doing its thing. It's a human construct to think it should pop out in an old church or a castle or, haunted old mansion or whatever. They're our popular conceptions about what haunted looks like, aren't they? And yet, to my mind, what we're trying to find is what are the explanations for paranormal, things that don't fit into our normal explanations every day.
Yeah.
And things that we know, can and do happen, sort of thing. When you see something or experience something that you cannot explain or find an explanation for, then you've possibly got something paranormal. And quite a large range of that can be explained as haunting or described as haunting. And that means when you get something like TGI Fridays in Bracknell, which this particular one we're just coming into talking about happened in, why not? Why not in a modern building like that as to any other? Particularly, if you are going to be of the school of it has to have been, somebody who died there or some tragic event or whatever in order to get a haunting. This is England we're talking about. It has a history going back thousands of years of human occupation. And we're a very small island in the grand scheme of things. You zoom out to a world view and look how tiny England is on it.
Yeah.
Well, then people are going to have tramped all over it at some point during history constantly. And who are we to say whether anything ever happened on that particular square metre of soil at some point in those several thousand years? We couldn't possibly know the answer to that.
No, exactly.
So, maybe something tragic did happen, and maybe that is the sort of common usage of the word haunting that people seem to assign to it, that there has to have been some kind of death whatever. But maybe it's just the paranormal, like I say, popping its head out wherever it wants to.
Yeah.
The fact is, you can't ignore, or in my view, this is when I'm capturing data and on my databases that everybody's heard me talk about, you can't just sweep something under the carpet and ignore it because it doesn't fit into a paradigm that you're looking at.
Yeah.
And this is why, when I go out on my ghost posts, as I call them, putting out requests on social media for people to talk to me about this location or that location, I'm very careful never to say, has anybody seen the ghost of the White Lady down such and such a road or in such and such a building? I'll say, has anybody experienced anything of the alleged haunting or anything paranormal or anything they can't explain? I'll phrase it in one of those more nebulous terms and not specify what it is I've been told is there, because that way I get their own honest recollections back. If they think, oh, that's odd, somebody's asking about that TGI Fridays that I had that weird experience in, I'll write to her and they'll tell me what their experience was and not try to tailor it to what they think I want to hear.
Yeah. Well, this is a prime example of that, because what made you aware of it and the follow-up experience that you got clearly are not connected, because they're not the same thing.
No, not at all. So I came across this one. This is a lot of my entries on my database I come across because somebody mentions to me, and I put an entry on my database and I start scouting around looking for other things. But you can imagine, whilst I'm scouting around trying to find other, correlations about that, I stumble across lots more interesting stories in nearby locations, or, because I've gone on to a social media site for that particular location, town or whatever, it throws up other locations within that town. And this was one of those. I was looking for something else, but I stumbled across a request from 5 years ago. So that would have been 2017, 2018 sort of time.
Yeah.
On a social media site from the town of Bracknell, asking whether anybody had any information on what was on the site, the physical location, before they built TGI Fridays. And the reason the person who put that request out was asking was because she'd been out for a meal there with friends and had felt a large hand grip her on the back of her head, even though there wasn't an actual person stood behind her gripping her on the head, because obviously that would have taken them down an entirely different route.
Yes.
Like, call the police.
Absolutely.
So she was sitting with a group of female friends, and her friend sitting next to her kept sensing a male presence around them, trying to touch them. She said it didn't feel aggressive or anything, just like somebody was trying to make contact. So obviously that friend was somewhat sensitive in some way, and they were curious as to what had been there before TGI Fridays had been there, to see whether they could find out what it was that they'd sensed. Well, of course, this is the kind of thing that immediately catches my eye because it's modern. You know, it's happened to somebody in modern times. And my database is, you know, things only make it into my database if it's happened within my lifetime. That was my initial original premise in what I wanted to write about, things that have happened in my lifetime, not interested in ghosts that were last seen in 18 something or other. You know, want to know about things that people are experiencing in the modern day and age.
Yeah.
So out of curiosity, and because I was researching, you know, another location in Bracknell and was going through maps and things anyway, I tried to see if I could figure out what had been there before TGI Fridays. And as far as I could make out, and I don't pretend to be any great researcher when it comes to, you know, comparing maps and overlaying maps and anything like that. So, you know, this is purely amateurish, this attempt, but it's the best I can do. It's the best I can work with. As far as I can tell, the modern complex that TGI Fridays is in Bracknell, there used to be an older shopping area there, you know, with various buildings dating back to various different periods of time. And it even had one of those old-fashioned bandstands. And that TGI Fridays, in fact, that whole complex that it's in, only opened in 2017. So it was only about a year old when this lady experienced this male presence in there. And as far as I could, with my amateurish skills, make out, it looks to me like it's possible that there used to be a pub standing roughly where TGI Fridays is, at least back in the 1940s. But again, you'd need somebody who's much more skilled than I am at that sort of thing. So because I was asking about another location in Bracknell, I included this one. Does anybody know anything about it? And I'm using a pseudonym here, as I do for most names in my books, to keep people's privacy. But Joanna wrote to me and said, well, it's kind of weird that I've been asking about TGI Fridays, because she'd been in there in the restaurant area having lunch with her husband about 5 years ago, which would take it to also 2018, so roughly the same time. And during the course of lunch, she'd gone to visit the ladies' loo. So she's, you know, it's fairly quiet with it being a lunchtime. She's alone in the ladies' toilet area, which is one of those toilet areas that has several cubicles and then wash basins and mirrors that are communal. She was alone in there, was washing her hands at the communal sinks, when the last cubicle in the line, the toilet lid slammed down suddenly, and then the cubicle door slammed violently shut. And the way she described it to me, you know, it was a horrific noise as the lid went down and then the door slammed shut.
Yeah.
And she just said, believe me when I say I ran so fast out of there. I can't say as I blame her. Told her husband about it straight away. He was totally spooked out by the experience, but had nothing to explain it. There weren't any windows open or anything like that. This was simply standing in, you know, a bathroom in a modern day restaurant, and one of the toilet lids suddenly slams itself down and the door slams shut in that cubicle. Now, if it had just been the toilet lid, I would have thought, well, perhaps it would just fell, you know, perhaps it was up and balanced a bit precariously and doesn't have one of those soft close mechanisms on it like mine has, you know, and just fell and slammed shut. But for the toilet lid to go down and then the cubicle door to slam shut leaves you with that thinking, that's a bit odd. A little bit odd. And again, you know, that's the kind of thing that I will never try and sex up a story, you know, put extra to it than was there. You know, I'm not going to claim that there's a portal in that toilet. Just on that particular day, something rather odd happened in there. And it so happens that I found out about that because I'd read that somebody else had experienced something odd in that TGI Fridays.
Yeah.
You know, so if anybody's listening and they've been in that one and had some weird experiences of the paranormal kind,
yes.
I don't want to have weird experiences, thank you very much. I'd be inundated, wouldn't I?
Absolutely. Especially with the 2-for-1 cocktail offer they do.
Absolutely. And yeah, please do write into me, because I'm as equally interested as odd little modern day snippets as this as I am in, more sort of established ghosts, or, more traditional ghosts, if you like.
Yeah.
Because to me, this is what the paranormal is. It's an unexplained incident. It might be that if you went, you could find a way of replicating that. Might have been able to debunk it if you were of that kind of mind, if you were there. But otherwise, it stands as a, something weird happened.
I mean, the thing about haunted toilets as well is that some of them are quite odd. And with it's not a subject I've delved into. I do know someone who's interested in the paranormal who is a pagan, Steve Jones, who is from Wakefield area here in Yorkshire, Ruth. And he's a big fan of finding haunted toilets.
Is he?
And I know he was once telling me he went to a pub, I think it's in Retford in Nottinghamshire, and he went in and he was the only person there. There was a young lady behind the toilet, and he thought better off than striking up a conversation about, is your toilet haunted? But he'd gone in there because that particular pub is once again, this is one of the other aspects of haunted toilets. Strange things only happened in a certain cubicle. It didn't happen everywhere else, whereas, as we've just been saying there, this particular toilet didn't have a window or a draft or anything to cause this. This was the same kind of thing. It had a small window high up, but it was closed a lot of the time when people were reporting things of strange occurrences occurring. And that was the same. The toilet door would slam violently. The lid would open and close. And I've always wondered, well, if it's a draft or something like that, surely it would be affecting all the cubicles, not just one.
Well, exactly. Why would just, and particularly when it's replicated more than once, in that example that you're talking of, is, people know that it's happened more than once in there. Why just that one cubicle? You'd really want to go in there as a paranormal investigator and try and see, okay, is there something about, I don't know, if a big lorry goes past and vibrates, that somehow it affects that cubicle, or, is there one of those weird, like if somebody opens one door and somebody opens another door somewhere else in the building, it causes one of those through drafts that only catches that cubicle. So if I could find a way of debunking it, fine. But otherwise, you've got to explain, why does this weird thing keep happening in this one cubicle?
Yeah.
What is the fascination? I was just quickly looking while we were talking then to see if I know of any in Retford with haunted toilets.
I'll have to ask him, and then I'll send the information on for you, Ruth.
Well, I've actually got a whole load in Retford, Yeah. So, yeah.
I'm not surprised. It's a strange place, and that's before
place. Very big place.
Even before you get to the paranormal.
I couldn't possibly comment.
But I always like these kind of experiences. They make me smile because you stumble across them now and again when you're researching or reading about the paranormal. One of my favourite ones is in Kingston upon Hull. There's a Hull University accommodation. I don't know if it's still there now. Called Ferrens Hall, I think it is. And this one's always struck me because it's quite unusual, because students will see shadowy figures lurking around both the men's and women's toilets. But they also hear some ungodly howling noises, like somebody's in terrifying pain, Ruth.
Oh.
And when you dig into it, you discover that Ferrens Hall used to be a high-security psychiatric hospital.
Oh, wow. Well, that puts the hairs up on the back of your neck, doesn't it?
Absolutely, especially as, sadly, I think all of us are aware of some of the treatments, or I say treatments in the loosest possible sense, that were often prescribed to people who were unfortunate enough to find themselves in such units.
Absolutely. I mean, there would be howls of pain and horror, wouldn't there?
Yeah, yeah.
That is creepy. And it's funny because it puts me in mind for totally different circumstances. There's a pub just up the road from here where I am. I say just up the road, I mean literally about 5 miles up the road. We sometimes go there for Sunday lunch, and they've heard in their gents' toilets, which are in a little sort of a single-storey building that's kind of a tag-on the side of the much older it's a very old building, and this single story is very old as well, but it's clearly kind of an add-on on one side.
Yeah.
That's where the gents' toilets are. And she's heard awful sort of growling and squealing noises from in there, and to investigate, and found nothing, nobody in there. But with a bit of digging around into the history of the pub, she found out that used to be the pigsties.
Oh.
And of course, pigs can make some very odd, squealy, growly noises, can't they?
Oh, not half.
Yeah. So that's what she was hearing, was the pigs emanating from the gents' toilets when there was nobody about. What is now the gents' toilets, but used to be the pigsties. Yeah. So that's another example of a sound carrying forward in time, isn't it?
And an animal one at that. And
an animal one on this case, and no doubt there were, pigs that were in distress at the diet. Sometimes they're very intelligent animals.
Yes.
They might, realise when they were being taken out to go to slaughter, who knows? And then, where you're talking with the asylum, that's people in a lot of distress. And that is often what the most common paradigm for a haunting, to go back to that definition, is that where somebody's died in distress is what causes a haunting, a lot of people think, don't they? So, have we got example of that here with pigs and with humans? Or have we simply got stone tape type, just a reverberating sound, reverberating down through history?
Yeah.
Or have we got momentary time slips? Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, one of my favourite toilet ghosts is the the famous phantom flusher of the Bow Bells in the east of London, which is a story that always makes me chuckle. Whatever it is likes to flush the toilet when people are sat on it. But this was one of those that these started to report when it used to be the old chain flush type.
That you had to reach above and pull the chain down, yeah.
And obviously the house I grew up in that was haunted, the toilet flushing would be the signal that we were going to have some entertainment for the next hour or so, Ruth.
Oh, was it?
Yeah. Always started, the toilet would flush. And once again, that was a pull chain. It was me, my mum and dad and my brother there. There was nobody else in the house. The toilet would flush. And it was always a very strange thing because we uncovered the old servants' room that was like halfway up the wall in the toilet.
Oh.
And we did some exploring once and all went up there, and it was just a rickety staircase. We went up and there was like a little bed and a table and a candle holder and a candle there. Literally, I don't know.
Proper haunted stuff.
Yeah, 2 to 3 inches of dust on it. It had clearly nobody had been up there for years and years. But yeah, toilet always used to flush. We thought, right, okay, let's see what happens tonight.
Because as you know, I also grew up in the poltergeist, which is how I also got into this whole field, the interest in it. And a lot of the stuff that did was in the bathroom.
Well, once again, the connection with water again, as always, that people would point to.
Yeah.
Well,
there you go.
Absolutely. And they're very varied as well. Very varied. I mean, as we were saying, my local next to where I work, the Old Queen's Head, they've got a toilet ghost there, and that's only in the ladies, and likes to harass people when they're in the toilets by rattling the door handles. As though it's, come on, I need the toilet.
So you hurry up and dash out only to find nobody there.
Exactly. So and they're not the biggest toilets. They're not the kind of place you could pull a prank and hide it. I'll say that for them. I would just like to clarify that as well. I used to be an ex-landlord, so I have visited lots of ladies' toilets through business in regards to my job, rather than just wandering into toilets here and there.
Well, it does make me chuckle because I have a couple of times been on journeys and using motorway services. And a couple of times I thought something weird was happening when using the loo, and the toilet flushed while I was using the loo. And then I realised that they've got those motion sensors on them now.
Yes.
And if you lean back slightly too far, you set the motion sensor off.
Yes.
And get a bit of a shock.
Yeah.
But that's not haunting people, that's motion sensors.
I think they also have to do that because, unfortunately, with motorway service stations, some people just don't bother flushing the toilet, Ruth.
No, of course not, yeah.
Because it's certainly a journey of discovery using motorway service toilets, and that's all I'll say on that matter.
There's one on the M6 that is haunted.
Is there?
Haunted, yes, on the M6 up towards Keel Services, I think.
Oh.
Yes. And that's got the ghost. If I remember rightly, I think it's a soldier ghost hangs around the toilets area at Keel Services.
Oh.
There you go. I can see why your friend is so interested in toilet ghosts now.
I will pass that on. Because, have they said what type of soldier is it? Is it your traditional sort of old-fashioned one, or is it somebody in modern soldier clothing, would they say?
I want to say it was a World War I type uniform, but that's just off the top of my head.
Mm.
Yeah, as you've probably noticed, anybody who's listening to me talk before, is I have a memory like a sieve. I'm easily distracted and a useless memory. But I seem to think it was the ghost of a World War I soldier. I'll have to have a look for that. See what it was.
Intriguing. Well, strangely enough, leading on to the next one, this leads once again. We start in the toilet. We need to pull this conversation upwards, I think, after this one.
Absolutely. It's out of the gutter.
But this is one of those strange areas that you've come across, because I know in a couple of your books you've discovered it's a selection or a collection of properties or a specific area that seems to be haunted, rather than one particular location or one shop or one home. And this one here is in the wonderful Bury St Edmunds. Beautiful place, beautiful beer from there, in the picturesque county of Suffolk. And this is one where we've got, once again, a wine bar with strange goings on in the bathroom.
And you can tell you're a northerner because you're using the northern pronunciation for Bury.
Yes.
In Bury St Edmunds, it's pronounced Berry.
Yeah, well, Bury.
Well, I had to include Bury St Edmunds in the book, and
Yes.
I'm always interested in Bury St Edmunds because I actually lived there for a while.
Yeah.
As a child, and we have. I've done well for haunted houses. We did have a haunted house there.
I'm not surprised.
No, not as active as the one with the poltergeist, but we actually lived in a house that was in the grounds of the old prison. Well, I say house, it was a bungalow, and it was the prison where one of the last public hangings in Britain took place, and the old prison wall that the hanging took place from was still standing at the front. And there were 5 bungalows built into the grounds, and the central tower of the prison was still standing, which was a hexagonal tower that used to have wings off it that were all gone now. And our bungalow was the very last one that you came to by driving into this little gathering of bungalows. And interestingly, the guy who owned the bungalow next to ours was called Mr. Death. Yeah, true story. He really was. But he used to like it to be pronounced Diath, Mr. Diath.
Yes, I've noticed that working in customer services over the years, the amount of people that have changed it and changed it up so it says Dieth instead of Death.
Yeah, but it was written just like Mr. Death.
Yeah.
But yeah, so we've had a bungalow there that had a modern day lady sometimes seen walking through it, and sometimes a little boy walking through it. And I used to go to school at the amazing St James's School there, which is right next to the Abbey Gardens.
Oh.
Because in the middle of Bury St Edmunds, there's a river flowing through it. Beautiful old town. If anybody listening gets the chance to visit, do. So right in the centre of the town is the remains of the old abbey, which are now just some ruined flint walls. But the formal gardens are still all laid round it as a park. Very, very pretty, with the river flowing through it. And there are still some of the older parts of the abbey wall and some of the newer buildings that were built into the wall. And by newer, I mean sort of medieval. So still very old buildings, form the centre of the town. And then as you go out of the park and through the Abbey Gate, which is a big ornate tower, a tower that's a gate through it, you come out onto Abbey Gate Market, the Market Hill, which is a big car park essentially, surrounded by wonderful old buildings and that are now shops and some of the houses, some of the hotels, whatever, of all different eras. And one of them used to be a Peter Dominic's wine bar. Don't know whether it still is or not. I'm not sure it is. I think it might be a coffee house now. But and this chap, again, I'm using a pseudonym, but Simon wrote into me to say that he used to work there in the Abbey, in the wine bar, and said that people working there would see shadow figures walking about, and that sometimes they'd get poltergeist type activity. So he remembers one waitress one evening, on duty, saw a hooded figure that she thought looked like a monk. And of course, we are very close to what used to be the Abbey.
Yeah.
Just glide past the kitchen door. And as she sort of stood there with her mouth open, staring at the kitchen door, thinking, what the heck did I just see? One of the knives lifted itself off the kitchen counter and then sort of chucked itself at the floor so that it stuck itself point downwards into the kitchen floor, as if, like a knife thrower had thrown it. Which is enough to put you off your evening shift, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm on table service tonight. Goodbye.
Yes. Not working in here. I suddenly feel very ill and I'm going home.
Yes.
And Simon was sort of, one of the managers on duty, so it was his job to sort of calm her down and sort of help her sort of get over it and get on with working that evening. So he got that first hand from her himself. It wasn't just a sort of hearsay sort of story that he heard. That this was actually one of his staff that it happened to.
Yeah. And
of course, while looking into that and asking around about it, I just got so many other people writing out, because honestly, Bury St Edmunds, the whole place must be absolutely haunted. I think it's featured in probably every one of my books, almost.
Yes.
I know it's definitely in the Almanac of British Ghosts for a cyclical haunting. Can't remember the date of it. But yes, it's just one of those areas that its history goes back so far. It would be entirely remiss of it if it wasn't haunted.
Yes.
Left and centre. But yes, so several of the properties get these misty figures of monks, which you would expect, being so close to the old Abbey. One person told me that his friend's brother used to work in one of the businesses on the same street, stayed late one night helping to do a stock take. Two of them working there that night, doing this late night stock take. When they finished, they sort of said goodnight. One of the lads left. The friend's brother stayed for a minute just to go to the loo before setting off home. Again, back in the bathroom.
Yes.
I thought we were getting ourselves out of the gutter. We seem to have gone right back in. So he's washing his hands in the bathroom, sensed somebody coming up behind him, looked up expecting to see his workmate had entered the room, and instead he's got the shadow figure of a monk standing there with him. And it was only a very small bathroom. So yeah, he beat a bit of a hasty retreat, but I'm not sure I'd want to come face to face with the ghost in a small bathroom.
No, absolutely. Especially late at night when you're the only person and your friend's just left you.
Exactly, and you're alone and you've got to lock the building up. And you can't be derelict in that duty, can you? You've got to turn the lights out and lock the building up or you're going to lose your job.
Yeah, there was nothing I used to dread more when an alarm used to go off at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and you'd have to you were on the call rota to go and unlock the premises, Ruth, and wander in on your own. Many a taxi driver I've taken in with me. Security.
Well, it was good to the taxi drivers. But isn't it funny how places that are busy during the day seem super spooky when they're empty?
Yeah.
There's something about spaces that are normally busy, like schools or offices or shops, anywhere that normal life is a sort of bustling, busy thing in it. And then when you have to go back to it when it's an empty space, it seems to take on a kind of semi-malevolent life of its own quite often, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think sometimes it's the presumption that something has to be filling the space, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's a kind of a human construct to expect something to happen because it's alien to how it normally feels or something.
Yeah.
I don't know, but yeah, they do feel oddly spooky, empty buildings, and to have to do it when you know that something has happened in there or has just happened in there, not my idea. Well, I suppose if I was actively looking for the ghost, it'd be my idea of fun that night, but it wouldn't be my idea of fun if it happened when I wasn't looking for a ghost one particular night.
No.
I do wish the paranormal would learn, would you please appear when I'm out looking for you? but leave me alone when I don't want to see you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. It's one of the few times you're delighted to discover a drunk hiding in the toilet at 4 a.m.
Yeah. Oh dear.
But I mean, you've even got a policeman who's had some strange experiences. This just seems like a very spooky street.
Well, if for anybody who knows Bury St Edmunds, I mean, it does literally face the Abbey, and the buildings around there are from all eras, of the time of the town's been there. It's an incredibly ancient town. And there just seems to be overlays of hauntings from all different periods, to be honest. And again, we come back to what is a haunting, but there does seem to be overlays. And this policeman has done quite a few, obviously, night shifts, doing the night patrol when that was still a thing. And he finally became to believe in ghosts because he just kept seeing odd, misty figures walking about the place in the wee small hours of the night, partially see-through figures. Funnily enough, this in order to walk home from school, I had two choices when I was at St James's School. I could either walk out the top of the school and cross fields and walk the 2.5, 3 miles it was to my home, across fields, or I could go down the bottom of the school, the lower end of the school, cross a footbridge over the river into the Abbey Gardens and walk out through the Abbey ruins, through a side gate, not through the main gate onto the market square, but through a side gate, and then walk down old streets all the way back to my house. So I often had to walk through the Abbey ruins just as it was getting dark in winter, because obviously when school finishes, it's just as it's getting dark in the depths of winter, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I often had to go through the ruins, either in the early mornings when it was still dark or in the afternoons it was going dark, because then it was usually too muddy to go across the fields. So then you'd have to do the ruins in the dark, and that was often quite creepy. But I can't remember experiencing anything particularly odd, although I did see there's a graveyard on the side of the ruins. There's a church there, which is called a cathedral, Bury St Edmunds Cathedral, but it's not as big as you imagine most cathedrals. It's like a large church. Yeah. It's where my school used to attend it, and I used to sing in it in the choir. And I did see a weird little old lady in a grey shawl darting around behind the gravestones when I was walking home from there once. To this day, I don't know whether she was just a weird little old lady or whether she was something paranormal, because she was behaving very oddly. But I kind of I was only a kid, I kind of scarpered out there. I didn't want to come face to face with her.
Yeah.
But that was the only thing that I ever saw that I thought was odd there. Well, I did have a family of ducks that I made friends with. That was nice.
Yeah. Well, I think when you're going to meet people acting strangely, once again, it's where they are that heightens the sense of strangeness. And I think if you see somebody acting strangely on a busy street, you just think, oh, well, that's somebody just being strange. But when you're a child walking through a graveyard at twilight and you see somebody bobbing about, then it's a whole different ball game, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's a scarper as fast out there as you can, a ball game.
Yeah. Burn some leather.
Lots of future possibilities of being a paranormal researcher are nowhere near your mind at that point.
No. I mean, another subject that we've not really touched on previously, but we've got a brilliant story, is this gentleman, Lawrence, about his spell at North Tyneside General Hospital.
Do you know, this is one of those stories that Lawrence, and this is his real name, he asked me to use his real name, but he wrote to me, and he's one of those wonderful people that wrote the story out so well that it's practically verbatim as it appears in the book. I've only tidied up a couple of sentences, nothing more than that. So it is almost absolutely verbatim how he told it to me. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to actually read it, because that's in his words.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay?
Yeah, of course it is. Absolutely. What I would like to say before you start, though, is I've also been admitted to hospital and given, I can only imagine it was morphine due to what happened, Ruth, and what I saw. So I've got a bit more experience, perhaps, than some people of extremely powerful sedatives
Yeah.
being administered when you're really ill. And I hallucinated, but I had the wherewithal. I mean, because clearly what I was seeing couldn't possibly be real. It had to be a hallucination, because I basically saw a group of fairies come to see me in the hospital bed as I was about, and I thought, whoa, because I just felt really, I don't know what, they never told me, Ruth. They didn't say they were giving me morphine, because I'd been admitted with quinsy, so I was very seriously ill. This is only a couple of years ago. 3 years ago, actually, as we speak today. Another strange coincidence. And so I could feel the effects it just came on very quickly. And then all of a sudden I saw all these little lights popping around me, like flashbulbs going off. And then about half a dozen fae appeared. And they gave me the impression they were coming to see if I was okay and to make me feel safe. And then I just went under. I was gone. I was fast on. And that was it. But it stuck with me so much that I was able to remember it. And obviously had quite a heavy dose because of what I could see and where it sent me and how quickly I was out. But afterwards, I didn't have any effects. I didn't see anything. I didn't think I was imagining anything at all after that. But they must have given me a pretty hefty dose for it to have had the effect it did. So when Lawrence explains that he was given morphine, I'm fully understanding his frame of mind and how long that would have affected him, because it certainly isn't responsible for what happens.
No, because he was only given it when he very first went in. So that's really interesting. Do you know? Because I mean, the chances are you're probably right. It was probably hallucination. But what if it wasn't?
Well, I had actually done. I mean, this is the thing. It wasn't on my mind. I'd recently interviewed a lady called Morgan Daimler, who's a phenomenal writer about the Fae and myths and legends of the Celts. So I'd recently done it, but I hadn't been thinking about it at all. I'd actually, strangely enough, Ruth, I'd got one of your books with me to read whilst I was in there.
I feel quite honoured.
to keep me going. And once again, I was the youngest person on the ward. I was surrounded by 2 or 3 older gentlemen who were seriously ill, bless them. So when I read it, it struck me as just, it really reminded me of my experience, other than mine certainly wasn't as supernatural as Lawrence's is anyway.
Well, fascinating though. Fascinating. So here's Lawrence's story anyway, and this is in Lawrence's words. So Lawrence says, around 2000, I was admitted to Rake Lane Hospital in North Shields or North Tyneside with severe stomach pains. I was given morphine initially on the night of my admittance, and I ended up staying for a week and a half. The ward I was in had 6 beds within the space, and all were filled with older gentlemen with various health issues. I would have been in my early 20s at the time, and I had been given a bed nearest the entrance to the ward. That left 2 other occupied beds on my side of the ward between me and the window, and 3 beds on the opposite side of the room. There were 3 sash windows along the wall farthest from me, which could be opened a little to let fresh air in. On maybe the 4th day after being admitted, and this is where it's important because he only got morphine on the 1st day, so on maybe the 4th day after being admitted, I was laying in my bed facing the entrance to the ward, waiting for a visit from my mother. I was idly watching other visitors and staff go about their business, when I noticed the edge of my bed begin to sink as if someone had sat on it. At the same time, there was a distinct blast of chilly air, as if one of the windows had been open wide. I felt the space on the bed behind me for signs of a visitor sitting there, and also turned my head to see if the window had been opened, which it hadn't. The 2 beds between me and the window were occupied, so I would have been surprised if any breeze had been able to hit me so directly, even if the window were open. I continued to feel the cold feeling along my back, along with the presence I could sense on the bed behind me. There was no noise apart from the odd beep from equipment around the ward and other sounds coming from elsewhere. Then, in an instant, the bed rose behind me, along with the rush of cold air against my back, and the sensation disappeared. It was just as if whatever it was had stood up and moved away. Eventually, my mother appeared, and I told her what had happened. I debated mentioning it to one of the more friendly nurses who attended to me, but in the end I said nothing. Eventually, I was discharged and gave little thought to what I felt once I was out of the hospital. However, within a week or so, I was readmitted with the same issue and was placed back in the same ward, on the same section, but this time in one of the beds beside the window, on the opposite corner of the room from the bed I had initially been in. The days passed by as the nurses tried to make me well again, and soon enough the old gentleman who was occupying the bed I had originally laid in was getting ready to go home. He left just before lunchtime, and the nurses came and cleaned the station and changed the bed ready for its next occupant. From my position in the corner, I could watch everything that went on around the ward, as there wasn't much else to do. That afternoon, as visiting time approached, I once again was hopefully watching the entrance waiting for my mother. Before she came, an older-looking gentleman made his way into the room. His hair was jet black and looked slicked with Bilkeen, but despite this I could tell he was in his late 50s or early 60s. He was wearing purple pyjamas, which were buttoned up with the collar left open. He walked past the end of my old bed, which was still sitting pristinely made, waiting for its next occupant, then turned and sat on the edge of it. I thought it a little odd that he was bringing himself to his new bed with no nurse to accompany him and get him settled in, so I was watching him quite closely out of idle curiosity. He stood by the empty bed and kicked his feet a couple of times, as if trying to dislodge slippers. He then carefully lowered himself on the edge of the bed, looking like it was quite difficult for him to do. I was wondering if maybe he belonged in a different ward and had accidentally come back to the wrong bed. Within 10 seconds of him sitting down, to my utter astonishment, he began to slowly dissolve, vanishing as he faded right before my eyes. Nobody else seemed to be looking at him, yet until that moment it appeared entirely solid and normal to me, and the only interesting thing about him had been that he seemed to be putting himself to bed in a new ward without a nurse there to help him. I sat staring at the bed, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen happen. I thought, had I been bored and just hallucinated? Did any medication I'd been given cause me to see things? When my mother arrived, I waited till the midpoint of our conversation to tell her what I'd just seen. A few weeks later, after I'd returned home, it occurred to me that maybe the first time I'd been in hospital and had felt those strange sensations whilst laying in that bed, had it been that ghost that I'd felt. It turned out that all I had was a stomach infection, so apart from that original morphine on that first night, I was never given anything stronger than paracetamol and was on a drip to ensure I stayed hydrated. There was therefore nothing medically speaking that would have induced hallucinations. And that's Lawrence's story, and he says that stuck with him all these years, mainly because he didn't really believe in the paranormal, and until then had always thought ghosts were kind of the, wispy see-through things. And that man was entirely normal and solid-looking until he started to fade away, and suddenly wasn't there.
It's remarkable, and that's why it really struck me, because what he describes, it's just so clear, even down to the movements of somebody trying to kick slippers off, Ruth. It's crystal clear. And he's obviously got the power of forethought to analyse it, to think about it, to understand the medication he was on, to realise a possible sceptical explanation for it, and yet when he comes to the end of it, he realises that, well, it's only paracetamol.
Yeah, but the chances of that causing hallucination are just, really slim. I mean, you could maybe argue that the first time he was there, the reason he was lying on his side was he was in a lot of pain, from the stomach infection. So, perhaps the illness itself might cause hallucination. But it seems really odd that the first visit he hallucinated something, and then the second visit he hallucinated something to explain the first something. That is one of those instances where if you try and go down that as an explanation, it becomes more weird than the actual reality, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The fact that he was in the bed and then readmitted a week later to be able to view the bed he was in when he had the first experience, I think just takes it to a different level, because if it was you would suggest that if he was going to hallucinate anything, it would be the first time, but he didn't. He saw it the second time.
Yes. All he did was have the sensation the first time of somebody sitting on the bed for a moment and felt behind him and there was nobody there, and didn't really think much more of it, just thought that was a bit odd. But the second, if you like, full-bodied apparition was the second time, and he was definitely only on paracetamol and a saline drip there. And he knew he was awake because he knew he was watching and waiting for his mum. And the only thing, as he said himself, the only thing that interested him about this old man was the fact that he'd come in on his own to come to this, newly made up bed. Whereas normally a new occupant would be brought in by a nurse.
Yes.
Settled in and, things put in the cupboard and pillows plumped up and, the whole routine.
Yeah.
But this old gentleman came in by himself and sat on the bed, and he was looking at him and wondering, are you in the wrong room? Why have the nurses left you to do this on your own? Never occurred to him he was looking at something odd until the old boy started to disappear. At which point, yeah.
I mean, even the fact you can describe his hair slicked back as though he's got Brill cream on it, which is something that is a very distinct look. It's not as popular as it used to be. I mean, when I had hair, Ruth, I was a big believer in Brill cream. I was one of those young chaps who'd been influenced by an older relative, and Brill cream got fashionable again at the end of the 80s. So it's as far as I'm aware, it's certainly nowhere near as popular as it was at that time. So it does give a distinct look when a man's got it on his hair, quite clearly.
That's that weird, shiny, very slicked back look, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Almost like a wet look.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, it's just a lovely story. And like I say, it's chimed with me on so many levels because I understand exactly what he's describing.
Yeah, and he wrote it so wonderfully for me. Like I say, that is almost entirely Lawrence's own words. There's only a couple of places where I just tidied the sentences up a little bit. But that's how he remembers it. That's how he wrote it to me. He obviously took his time to write it, because it's a recollection that stayed with him all these years. Because it's the only time he's come across the paranormal. But what a doozy of a time, and it's really stuck in his mind, understandably. So, yeah, brilliant story.
Absolutely.
And without people like that, to everybody listening now, if you've had one of these occurrences, if you've had something odd, please write to me, because as you can see, that's how I get my information. It's by ordinary people writing into me with their stories of what they've experienced.
Well, the next one is quite nice because this is someone that's listened to us talk before. So, which is very nice, and this is from somewhere that we don't usually talk about a lot. Once again, it's a big place, but it seems to often get overlooked when it comes to the world of the paranormal, which is Wolverhampton. Yeah,
I don't tend to get much up from round the sort of Birmingham, Wolverhampton way. And I think this is sort of big city syndrome in that it's difficult for me to get a toe in the door, as it were, to talk to people on social media. I find that, villages or small towns have much more active social media where people talk to each other. But in cities, big conglomerations like, the West Midlands, they really only use it for buying and selling things. They don't talk to each other in the same way. But so it's really good when I get stories from some of these areas. And yes, this was a chap. It's not his real name. Asked me to keep his name private, so none of the names are real in it. But Ewan wrote to me to say that I first heard you being interviewed on Paul Bestall's Mysteries and Monsters. So absolutely brilliant. This is what happens, people. You hear me on here, you write to me, it ends up in the podcast or in the book. Or both. So there's your incentive. Get writing.
Absolutely, and you may even appear on our next conversation.
You never know. But he got interested in writing to me because he likes the fact that I write about normal everyday ghosts. That everybody has, rather than just the haunted castles and so on, as we've said before. So this was an experience that actually happened to his mum. So it's coming in secondhand from him, told him by his mum, his aunt, so his mother's sister. And it happened to them when they were teenagers during the 1960s. And they used to live in Easter Park Way in Wolverhampton. So his mum lived with her parents, 2 sisters and 1 brother, so his 2 aunts and his uncle. And they lived in a typical post-Second World War, 3-bedroom terraced house that you see all over the place, up in that neck of the woods and many other towns in England. Very, very common sort of house that people live in. His mum and her sister, his aunt Pamela, used to share the same bedroom. And they both happened to look up at the same time one evening. They were sitting there chatting. Something caught their attention, must have done. Both looked up at the same time and noticed the figure of a sailor standing on the landing. At first, just for a moment, they thought it was their dad because they knew he used to work as a sailor during the Second World War. He served in the Navy. So I think that was just kind of an instinctive, it must be Dad. randomly wearing his old uniform. But almost immediately they realise it's not Dad, because as they look up, the figure turns away from them and just literally disappeared in front of their eyes.
Oh.
So for just that moment, they've got this sailor in a Second World War uniform. And of course, we're talking in the 1960s, so it's fairly recent history that they will have, people were wearing these uniforms at that time. So this wasn't an old ghost at that time. And he's pretty sure it's the only time they ever saw an apparition. But it wasn't the only strange thing that happened in the house. Because following that, what they had, and this is really odd, they sometimes had adult-sized and child-sized handprints and shoe prints appear on the walls and ceiling. And the shoe prints, particularly the child-sized ones, would look like a child had walked up the wall and walked across the ceiling. And they had absolutely no explanation for how that was happening. So they'd paint them over, but they'd just reappear through the paint. Just kind of over the next few weeks, they'd just kind of bleed back through the paint, if you know what I mean. And the only way they got rid of them, they didn't get rid of them, was to cover them over by putting wallpaper up and putting, those old plastic ceiling tiles that used to be very popular in the 70s. They put those all over the ceilings, and that way they couldn't see them anymore because they didn't bleed through the wallpaper or the plastic ceiling tiles. But they were definitely still there, because in the mid-1980s, so sort of 20 years later, his mum's youngest sister, Yvette, was the last family member still living in that house after the parents had died. Best family had married and moved out. Mm. So Yvette and her boyfriend were living in there, and they were planning to move into a new house together. It was a council house that they lived in, a tenancy. So before they moved out, they knew they had to redecorate it, make it all clean and tidy to end the tenancy with. So Yvette's boyfriend started the job of stripping all the wallpaper off and doing all the other bits of general maintenance to give it a lick of paint. And this is where my correspondent, Ewan, went round to the house with his mum to help tidy a few things up. He'd only been about 7 years old at the time. And they'd gone up to the upstairs front bedroom with his mum, who was, helping to sort of, get the house ready to be given back. And he saw, as this 7-year-old, these footprints and handprints all over the wall, where Yvette's boyfriend had already stripped the wallpaper off. Mm. And he asked his mum what they were. And she just sort of kind of dismissed it a bit and tried to sort of explain it away, that maybe some of the builders had done it when they were building the house. But the way children often do, he kind of, that's not right. He knew that his mum wasn't quite telling him the truth.
Yeah.
And he just couldn't get his head round, well, OK, builders might make handprints, but how did they put shoe prints up the walls and across the ceiling?
Yes.
And it was only years later, when the house was long gone and so on, and he's now a grown-up, that he happened to be in a conversation about ghosts and the paranormal with his Aunt Yvette, and she mentioned about those handprints and shoe prints and how they would keep reappearing. And that's when he was told the full story about them, and he realised that as a child he'd seen them and that they really were something unexplained and something paranormal. And he'd seen them as a kid, these marks that went up the ceiling and over the walls. So
that always strikes me as well, because that's not something that happens very often. I'm probably the one, as soon as I started reading it, the first similar occurrence that's jumped into my head about this is what's known as the Dodleston Messages, Ruth, which was the famous story about a gentleman called Ken Webster and his partner who had moved into a house on the English-Welsh border and ended up, allegedly, some people have dismissed it as an outright hoax, communicating on an old BBC computer with someone from 400 years ago.
Oh, yes, I have heard this one, yeah.
And part of that started with footprints appearing in because they were having the house renovated, and they started to see footprints appearing on the wall, and they would paint over them, and then they would come back.
And it's interesting because it's not the only time I've heard about marks and things like footprints and handprints appearing on a wall tends to be associated with poltergeist type activity, doesn't it?
Yes.
In this case, it was the only thing that happened that was kind of poltergeisty. And this ability to bleed through paint and come back again.
Yeah.
That paint won't get rid of it, that it somehow... And yourself, if you're painting over something on a wall if there's an oily substance, that will bleed through. If there's mould, that will bleed through a lot of paints, and you have to get special paints to paint over them, don't you? So whatever it is that they're seeing in the form of these footprints, handprints, is a physical substance on the wall, isn't it?
Yes.
In order to bleed through the paints. It's not a phantasm of a footprint or a handprint. It's an actual physical thing that is affecting the paint that's painted over it.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a whole new can of worms, isn't it?
Of course it is. And of course, you know, the people would explain it away, as you say, as just perhaps mould. But I find it very hard to believe that mould would appear in the shape of footprints and handprints across the wall and continually reappear in the same place. Because if you get a mould outbreak, it just spreads like wildfire. It doesn't just stick in one particular place. It will just cover the wall if it can.
Yeah. And I've never known it to look like handprints and footprints anyway.
No.
You might get the odd, you know, like seeing shapes in clouds.
Yes.
You might get, you know, on a wall with mould on it, you might get the odd little patch that you can make perhaps a similarity to a footprint of, but not a series of footprints going up the wall and over the ceiling and, you know, or a series of handprints.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me, in a more amusing way, Ruth, we once, in one of the pubs I once had a radiator leak on the wall, right? And it caused all the wallpaper to fall off. And it created a face. It looked like a face on the wall. So essentially we left it for about a week till we could get it replaced, get it all repainted and re-wallpapered. So we kept a list, and we basically, anybody that came in the pub, we said, who do you think that looks like? And we kept a list of all the people that were put forward. So we had things like George Harrison, Jesus, John Lennon, essentially any man with a beard and long hair.
Yeah.
And it was amazing how many different people, though, would give you different names. And so it made me chuckle, because we just kind of did it as a laugh, just to see, because it was kind of a running joke of like, oh, look, George is there, keeping an eye on us and all that kind of thing. So we just kept a list, and I think we had about 20 different famous people that when we asked our regulars or people coming in, who do you think that looks like? And so we just kept a list, and it was just something that amused us, that even on that level, and obviously I've always been a bit weird, as you could tell, I was finding out what people were seeing here, and we get a bit of pareidolia, and seeing how different people would see similar yet different people in the same image. It was quite interesting on that aspect, if nothing more than just amusement for some bored staff.
But that speaks so heavily, though, doesn't it, of experiments about how human recollection works. And, you know, each of those people will have looked at that image and seen a vaguely bearded, long-haired type image and have assigned it to the first person in their memory bank that their brain picked out who fitted vaguely that description.
Yeah.
And that's because, you know, the human mind physically reaches for an explanation of what it's seeing and looks in its memory banks for something similar, and will then try and assign what it's looking at to something. It's kind of the way the human mind works. And I certainly learned, you know, years ago when I was an investigator for fraud, and one of my jobs was to go and follow people, I very quickly learned that I would have to physically write down the colour of the car that I was suspicious of, as well as its number plate. Because if I thought in my head, oh, that's a red Fiat, and write its number plate down, by the time I got back to the office, it was a blue Fiat. And after, you know, it wasn't very many months of doing the job before I realised that this always happened, that if I saw a red car, I would remember it as blue, even though at the moment of time I saw it as red. And if I saw a blue car, I would remember it as red. So I would have to actually, as well as writing the number plate down, this is the person of interest to us, have to write the car colour down. Because if I tried to tell one of the other investigators, oh, you're looking for a blue Fiat, it became quite a running joke. Well, if Ruth says it's a blue Fiat, it's a red Fiat, okay? So I had to learn to write the colours down if they were red or blue. And it's not that I'm colourblind, because I'm not. I could physically see the red or the blue and see it correctly, but I remembered it wrongly every time. And just those weird little quirks of how the memory works in the human mind, isn't it?
Yeah.
And how people will try to assign So
yeah. Well, it is one of those things. I think often people say, "Oh, I can remember it clear as day," and I think when you delve into these subjects and with your work experience as well, Ruth, you realise that memory is fallible. You can, even without you trying to do it, it will fill in the blanks whether you want it to do it or not. It'll just do it automatically, and it is a strange thing.
Yeah. And they've run dozens of experiments on it to do with criminal recollection and criminal interviewing and what have you. And in fact, they even ran it on QI, an episode of QI, where Stephen Fry held up a wad of cash and an actor ran on behind stage, snatched the cash and legged it. And none of the contestants knew it was about to happen. And they immediately asked them what he'd been wearing and showed a lineup. And they each had a different recollection of what he'd been wearing.
Yeah.
In that few seconds since it had happened.
Yeah.
And so much more so when you add time onto. Which is another reason why I think it's so important to get these stories down in writing, because they are ephemeral. It's something that happens to somebody in a moment of time and then it's gone. And if somebody like me doesn't collect them and write them down for posterity so that people can compare different types of phenomena and have some actual data to go on, they will just blow away in the wind like trails of sand, won't they? Because the human memory just won't keep them properly.
Yeah.
A philosophical thought to end on, eh?
Absolutely. Well, I was going to say, there's that famous experiment known as the ape experiment, which, if you've never seen it, I'm one of those people. I don't know how anybody doesn't spot this. So, essentially, you've got a group of people passing a basketball, and we are told at the beginning, count the number of passes, how many times the ball is passed between this group of people.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to, because it didn't work for me. I thought, what the bloody hell's this monkey doing here? As after about 30 seconds or so, somebody in a monkey suit just walks through and does a silly dance and walks off. And I was like, what's he doing there? I'm trying to keep count. That's so stupid. And apparently, what was it? Something like, it's a 50-50 split whether you'll see the monkey or not, because you'll be so focused on the ball you won't notice it. I find it hard to believe, but apparently it's true. And I just find things like that incredible, that how can people not see something so glaringly obvious walking through the middle of a shot whilst this ball flies around it? It's not like sneaking on. It walks, does a silly dance, jumps about, walks off.
And yet people miss seeing it, yeah.
Yeah. Strange. And that's before we even go into that whole white and gold, blue and black dress thing that the internet gave us the other year.
Dress.
Honestly, that's a whole...
More arguments about that damn dress.
Well, I think the last one I want to touch on before you let you go is once again returning to a haunted pub, and this is the beautifully named the Rose and Crown, which is one of those a pub very close to my heart because it was one of my locals growing up down in beautiful Wiltshire in the town of Bulford. And once again, we've got one of those wonderful series of events where you've got the local skeptic who ends up getting something happen to him. So this is a whole collection of strange things that occurs in these little pubs. I love them.
And this one's, I mean, I've included this one in the book. People have heard me say before, I start off with a snippet and then I try and find correlations and I try and find, people who've experienced it. I do include ones in the books where I can't find a correlation and I can't find anybody who's experienced it firsthand. But I always say so if that's the case. And this is one of those ones where the first time I heard about it was a person writing to me and saying as a comment on a social media post to me personally that I should be asking about the Rose and Crown at Bulford in Wiltshire. Mm-hmm. Because practically everybody who drank in there either had something odd happen or saw something they couldn't explain. That was what was given to me as a snippet, that practically everyone who drank in there either had something odd happen or saw something they couldn't explain. So I did usual diligence and, went to our dear old friend Google and tootled around the place looking for information about it. And I found quite a long newspaper article where the landlord at the time had been interviewed, a chap called John Sutton, and he'd said that the pub was haunted by as many as 6 different ghosts. So he said there was the ghost of a Labrador dog, which haunted the upstairs rooms. Love a ghost dog.
Yeah.
But people only ever saw a glimpse of it as it was walking away from them. They didn't ever get the whole dog, if you know what I mean. They just got sort of the tail end of it as it disappeared.
Yeah.
If they tried to actually follow it to get a proper look at it, it would just disappear into thin air. But they said they also regularly heard the sound of a dog gnawing on a bone up there. I'm a little bit sceptical about that, I have to say, because that sounds like mice to me, but
yes.
Hey. He said that the sound of disembodied footsteps were heard running up and down the corridor, and that they sounded like a child's footsteps, and that sometimes small items were moved around upstairs. This is the upstairs part of the pub.
Yeah.
Some of the doors open and close at their own on times. Dark shadows were seen moving across the room. Strange noises heard from empty parts of the pub. Gas taps in the cellar would turn themselves on, and the cellar had a distinct feeling of a presence, so much so that they nicknamed that presence Billy. He'd been told by one elderly customer who didn't believe in the paranormal at all, that he'd seen a paintbrush flip itself upwards off the top of a paint can that was standing, when they were doing some redecoration. And another person had told him that there was a ghost called Fred who haunts the restaurant. And this other customer had told John, the landlord, that Fred the ghost was known to turn the vacuum cleaner off, turn the lights on and move the chairs about. When I asked locally, loads of people responded, at least 6 people, saying they were sure the pub was haunted and they'd all knew of people who'd experienced something there. But none of them admitted having any personal experiences themselves. One said they'd heard that dogs didn't like to go down to the cellar, and that they'd heard there was a ghost there referred to as George. So we've now got George, Fred and Billy at this pub. I think that might be the greatest number of nicknames in one location that's ever been given. But like I said, although I got lots of responses, it was one of those where everybody knew somebody who had. So to me, this is one of those stories that feels like at some point in time, probably when this article was written or shortly before that, there had been some activity, and tales of that activity have kept circulating ever since. But is anybody actually experiencing anything today? Well, if they're not, then if they are, they're not admitting it to me. So I'd be interested to hear if there is anybody listening who drinks at the Rose and Crown in Bulford in Wiltshire. Has it still got activity going on, or was this a period in time where things happened and then it all died down?
Yeah.
Because that's another interesting facet of the paranormal, isn't it? I get so many accounts like this one where it seems that, that there was a haunting of some description, or several hauntings perhaps. There was a lot of activity going on. But when you go out now and ask, all you can find is people who knew of somebody who knew of somebody, sort of a bit more urban mythy, and yet all centred on the same place and with the same sort of story. So it does feel like there was a spark of truth behind all of that. But is it still going on today?
Yeah. Well, I think it's quite similar to what we were saying about pareidolia and the way your brain can work. Is this one of those situations where, as you touched on there, Ruth, lots of people heard about the article, or the article's been shared because it's available digitally, and therefore now it's become, well, I've heard this story about this pub. Like you say, the fact that they've got Fred, Billy and George does seem to think, has this pub's ghosts now taken on a life of its own, where it's just it's crossed from reality into urban myth, as it were?
Yeah, and I suspect the answer is probably yes. But without, managing to find anybody that has actually experienced it, one presumes that whoever wrote the newspaper article that I'd found had actually spoken to the landlord, John Sutton, in order to have named him. But since then, I went out locally, and I always go out on as many social medias as I can find to go out on in the area. Although I did get answers, which means people were reading it and were interested, none of them had actually experienced anything themselves, despite the fact, if we go back to how I originally came to my attention, in 2021, somebody wrote to me and said that we ought to be talking about the Rose and Crown, as practically everyone who drank in there either had something odd happen or saw something they couldn't explain. And that's a big claim. Practically everyone who drank in there, compared to I can't find anybody who'll tell me what they've seen in there. Is that because they're shy of talking about it? Possibly. Or is it because, again, that's part of the urban myth that it was really, really, really haunted and everybody experienced something?
Yes.
But those people aren't around now because it isn't happening now.
Okay, well, there's a challenge for anybody in Bulford who may listen to this show. Have you been in the Rose and Crown? Has you been bothered by Fred, Billy or George? We need to know.
Or the Labrador.
Or the Labrador, yes, absolutely. Oh, well, Ruth, this is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to your books, because I know that the wonderful thing about your books is that there are so many stories from all parts of the UK. So yes, we've covered probably about half a dozen here. I know for a fact there's probably 250 in the new book, probably.
Probably. I haven't counted them, to be honest, but there's pages and pages and pages of them.
So it's a tempting morsel of the meal to come when the new book is arriving. So as always, my love, where can everybody get your previous works, follow you online, and keep up to date with everything else you've got going on over the hectic 3 months of publication coming forwards?
So you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. Just look up Ruth Roper-Wylde. My books are all available in paperback or as ebooks. Or if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read them for free, and they're all available on Amazon, plus other reputable online sellers you can get them from. You can also ask your library to stock them. They can pull them off if they've got access to the Amazon distribution channel, which most libraries have, I think. And I'm also on Pinterest and Instagram. So, and because it's an unusual name, Ruth Roper-Wylde, you'll find if you type it in, it comes up really simply. Because fortunately, I seem to be the only one, touch wood, with that name. So, yeah, so you'll find me. If you just Google that, it'll come up, or put it into the Amazon search bar if you're looking for the books. Or if you want a signed copy of the book, you can just contact me directly and I will provide one at the same cost as they are on Amazon without any extra charge for the signing, just for the postage and packing, obviously.
Wonderful. Well, I can't wait for both of them. Thank you as always, Ruth. You are a constant source of support and great company whenever you join me. Thank you for all your previous visits and hopefully many more to come, and we will speak soon.
Hopefully so, because I always really enjoy coming on here. Lovely to talk to you, Paul.
The feeling's mutual. Thank you as always.